I want to thank you all for being here. I know some of your faces have been here from the very start, which was around October of 2010, sorry, when we first did the first 2-year of survey to determine whether or not we could support a digital archives in the state of Hawaii. And you all helped us fill out surveys and meet with groups by either your agency or the IT people met with us really early on to see what kind of support we could depend on and what your constraints were. And so here we are. We're in the third year of the project. Oh my God. And and it's happening really fast now. And what we wanted to do is, since we haven't met for a while, we wanted to kind of bring you up to date of where we are, and we wanted to introduce some of our IT staff. So this is Donji Agnier.
Morning.
And this is Micah Takabayashi. And they will actually be doing the majority of the presentation today. Now you have to remember, these are developers, they're coders, they're gamers, they're not public speakers, okay? So be nice, be nice, but they're gonna learn to be public speakers.
But
so.
they're young also, which is
They're very young.
young.
Yes, they are. Because once they get a little older, they'll move on to the bigger money, which is what happens, right? Because the state can't really afford to keep the good ones sometimes. But anyway, and then we also have 2 interns here. We have Robert Patch, who's going to be sitting in for Adam since he can't get his computer over here because we had a problem with, anyway. And then we have Taylor Kennedy. They're both UH students. We've had interns on this project since the very beginning. And they're the 2 of our newest. Actually, we've been working with them all summer. And the interns always have special projects that they do in the digital archives, whether it's doing some specific build out that our regular staff don't have time for and needs to be done, or to do a lot of research or testing, which I think they've been doing a lot of, is testing tools to figure out which tool is best, comparing, will it work with our system for one, how fast is it when you put, there's one thing when you put, 5,000 records, but when you put 100,000 records against it, is it still as fast? That's what they've been doing, and doing matrices and determining what tools will work for us best. So we are a open source development organization. So because we knew from the beginning that we wouldn't have enough money to sustain this, and one thing you have to know is that when you go down the digital archive preservation path, you can't stop. And every 4 years you have to refresh new hardware, new software. You're always looking for the next format that's coming in and what is going to be the most migratable format. So these guys have perpetual jobs because their job is to keep us current. Because one thing you want to know is we have to preserve these, so they have to move. They can't stay in any obsolete format or on any obsolete hardware. So we chose open source as the base because we knew we couldn't afford the huge licenses, being a small agency that we are. So we had to think of a different way. So the tools they're using are tools that were developed by people like the British Library, Library of Congress, National Archives, and other groups who put out free tools for people to use. But they've had to tweak them, and they can do that. And then the other thing is we have to be able to work the system with what ICSD is building out. So there are going to be a few more expenses in licensing fees, but they're in our connection to the state system, not in our system itself, to making sure that it will work well. Okay then, the last person to be introduced is Adam Jansen, who is going to start this today. He's going to give you a background and emphasize the necessity of preservation for digital files.
Thank you, Susan. Aloha. Thank you all for showing up. For those of you who do not know, in particular, thank you for coming at 10 o'clock on 10/10. So you're here at 10 at 10/10. Electronic Records Day, binary 101010. We got really excited. I mean, we were ready to break out champagne and little poppers at 10:10 on 10/10 because it doesn't happen very frequently. But so, as Susan mentioned, the project got a little bit of a late start. I know this may come as a shock to you, but the budget for the project got a little hung up and a little bit delayed at the start, and recruitment of project-based programmers of quality is an arduous task to do that. So we got a little bit of a late start coming out of the gates, but the rate of change now is really starting to pick up. We've done, as she mentioned, a lot of testing of the tools that are out there, and now we're starting to bring it all together, and it's getting really exciting. So it's not quite ready for prime time, but we couldn't miss the opportunity of getting you all here and celebrating our nerdiness on Electronic Records Day. And so we wanted to share with you where we are, so you realize how daunting a task it really is when we say preserve, when we say digital archives. It's a much more complicated process than I think most of you realize. So, next slide, please. Again, apologies, the projector's out, so we're kind of having to do this a little on the fly. So bear with us, please. So we're going to talk about, again, why archives are important. What is it that we do that you can't? And why is it that we love what we do and you think is just kind of odd? In particular, it's that focus and importance of authenticity. Because as we preserve these records now and into the future, the only constant is change. We cannot hold on to what we have now. It will not be readable in 50 years. If we look back 20 years, does anybody remember WordStar? WordPerfect? Those little, they were black, about this size, had a little hole in the center. Yeah. We held on to them. A lot of good it did us. We're also going to start showing you how it is that you're going to interact with the digital archive. Specifically, one of the most important aspects, how are you going to transfer records to us? And then what exactly is it we are going to do in order to preserve those records in perpetuity? So when we talk about why archives are important, and again, please, above all else, our commitment is to protecting that record. And it's not just keeping that digital file and making sure it's backed up, because just doing that is insufficient. When we say protecting the record, we really mean not only the actual object itself, but also the important recordness, those aspects that make it a record and not just data. And specifically, that's the naturalness, that it was created in the usual and ordinary course of business, that it's related to other records that came before it and came after it. Because if you take a record out of context and have no pointers to what this was about, it doesn't make sense. So we have to maintain that interrelatedness. We have to make sure the record is impartial, that it has not been altered in any way. And that's part of the reason of transferring to the digital archives, because archivists are trusted, disinterested third parties. We've been trained, and our passion is protecting the record. So that's what we do. We need to keep the record authentic, and we'll talk about that next. It has to be what it purports to be, and we have to be able to demonstrate that the record itself has not been corrupted, which, given the fact that the only constant is change, gets to be a little difficult. Because if we know we have to change that file, there are certain things that we need to do for when we do change that file, that we've documented that chain of custody, that process that we've used. And then when you're dealing with records from 19 agencies and so many quasi-public agencies and everything else that's out there, how do you determine one record from another? How many annual report.pdfs are we going to encounter that need to be preserved? So how do we determine the uniqueness? One annual report.pdf from another annual report.pdf. So these are the aspects that we've been focusing on and continually asking ourselves, how can we address these and support these? Because we really have a new paradigm now. As we're shifting from paper to electronic, it's more than just changing the format itself. It's really about the way in which those records are created. And the way that they're being stored is much more fluid. They're on hard drives. They're on shared server drives. They're on USBs. They're on CDs. Is anybody storing stuff on CDs? Does anybody remember my talks before? CDs are evil. They're great for transportation, but not for long-term storage. We can have that discussion later. Anybody using the cloud? that gets to be even more difficult. So they can also be much more easily corrupted. Anytime you move those ones and zeros, there's the potential. Has anybody ever had a hard drive fail? A blue screen of death? I mean, it's so much easier. I mean, at least if you have a paper and it gets torn, you can still put it back together. But if your hard drive gets torn, you're in trouble. Viruses, they're out there. So we've got to do something different. So we also have much greater potential, though. We can provide much better searchability, much better access, 24/7, 365, from any of the islands, anywhere in the world. The public can get access to these records because we can extract metadata. We can do much deeper, more complex searches than we've ever been able to do before. And we can validate the integrity of those records. We can demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that those records have not changed. We can't do that in paper. We try, but the chances of finding a forgery, unless it's really, really important, are pretty small. But we can do better in electronic records. So specifically, we're talking about the authenticity, that the record is what it purports to be. Maintaining the integrity of that digital file is not enough in its own, because we can maintain a forgery and ensure that that file does not change. Doing so does not make that forgery authentic. So beyond just maintaining the integrity, there's something else. And that something else, from archival science and 400 years of diplomatics, is the identity of that record, that in combination with the integrity helps establish its authenticity. And that identity, as I mentioned, helps determine one version from another, the sender's copy from the receiver's copy, drafts from finals. Because remember, they could all have the exact same file name. So for a record to be what it purports to be, that is authentic, requires an understanding of the intent and the context of the creation, the collection, and the handling. Or as we like to call it, the chain and process of custody. And specifically what we're looking at is these metadata elements for identity. Who created it? When was it created? What matter or action created that record? Does it have a relationship to other records? What is its documentary form, the file format, for instance? Are there any digital signatures? Who are the people responsible for that chain and process of custody? And then from the integrity side of things, who handled it? We track every single thing we do to that record so that there's never any doubt. When you get down the line 30 years and say, well, you realize that's not a WordStar file, it's something else. We can say, yes, we know that. And we can tell you exactly what we did to get it from WordStar to PDF 3.0 because we document that, because it's important to us. Who was the custodian? Who was that preserving party? Are there any annotations to that record? Any notes about the process? Technical changes. The only constant is change. So do we account for that and how? The presence of more digital signatures, locations of any duplicates so that if it ever absolutely is called into question, you can compare the duplicate, which is stored off-site, to this one on-site, and hopefully they both match. And then the hash value, which is a unique signature that we'll talk about a little bit later. So now we're going to talk about how is it that you send records to the archives. So we're getting to that point where we're getting close to being able to start taking your records in. And this has really presented us an opportunity to create a whole new process that gives us a much better control and more security over how those records are transferred to us. And it really is an evolution of the current paper process. Has any of you transferred records to the archives, paper records? A lot of it's going to be the same, but easier, because we automatically fill out a lot of those boxes for you. You log in, you select what you're sending, and off it goes. And we'll give you a demo of that. So it requires more preparation, and we'll show you why. But once it's done, we've tried to automate the process as much as possible. We've got millions and millions of records coming out there. We can't look at all of them. We can't process all of them by hand. So we've tried to do an eyeballs off automation on as much of this to the extent possible while still trapping errors. So if something doesn't quite look right, we move it off and say, yep, this one does require special handling. But the vast majority will be automated. You send it, it's done, have a nice day. Makes your job much, much easier. And it really all starts with a digital transmittal plan. Oops, sorry. Other way. There we go. So this is the entire workflow. This is every one of these little boxes is a step that we have to do to preserve that record. A little more complicated than just sending it off-site on tape. This is what it takes to preserve records. There we go. So we've got the planning. All the preparation is step one. Step two, once that's all done, you can actually transfer the records into us. And then again, please. And then step three is the actual archival processing of that record. So let's talk about step one, which is that negotiation, understanding, preparation of the files themselves. And that starts with the digital transmittal agreement. And that can be something as simple as help. We need help. And that tells us it's time for us to go in. We also have a slightly more involved process where we actually get a signed memorandum of understanding between your agency head and our state archivist so that we can be very formal about this, which is also very much appreciated. And it really starts to lay out what we're going to do and what our responsibilities towards those records are. And it really iterates the fact that we want you to be involved every step of the way. We don't know your records. You know your records, so you have to help us understand them. And then after that, we go in and we ask for samples. We ask you to explain to us what these records are, how they're generated, how they're stored, so that we can start to understand that when we bring it in, we can provide that context. If you're outputting it from an existing computer system, a database of some kind, how are those files stored? What do the fields mean? What data type should be in those columns? Because if you tell us it's a date, we're going to check it's a date. Because if it's not, something happened. And then we use that accompanying data sample to tear those records apart, reconstruct them based on the information you gave us, and then say, is this correct? Did we do this right? And if the answer is yes, we're ready for transfer. So we've got quite a bit of prep work done, but once we get there, and we're about to demonstrate this to you, I think you'll hopefully be satisfied that we've tried to make it as easy on you as possible. So to do this, we've developed a transfer tool. We actually had a master's student from the University of Hawaii build his thesis around this. What is the most secure way of documenting the authenticity and getting records from you to us that we can possibly do? And he came up with this transfer tool and called it Kukini, which is speedy messenger in Hawaiian, because we want things to get from you to us as quickly and easily as possible. So we're going to switch gears. I'm going to move over there. Micah is going to come over here and walk you through what it is that we're going to do.
Right, so this is Kukini, our official file transfer utility. Notice first the login screen. Save for a few exceptional cases, any files transmitted to the archives will need to come through Kukini. And in order to use Kukini, you will need to be verified as a records producer, and you will need login credentials from us. So from step one, we're trying to ensure the authenticity of anything submitted to the archives. You log in, wait for it to verify your login. There. So you open Kukini, and this is what you see. Now, there are two visible components here, this panel on the left-hand side and a panel on the right-hand side. These visible components will change depending on who is logged into the system. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, security, and second, convenience. We want this process to be as painless as possible. So we basically hide any features that are not of interest to the person logged in, which you can determine based on their role. As far as security, there are certain features we have planned for Kukini that shouldn't be accessible to all users. For example, one thing we want to implement is the ability to look up and display records in the archives that have access restrictions, records that are not disclosable to the public. That's not a feature we want available to all users of Kukini. Also, if say an account gets compromised, we do not want the attacker to instantly have access to all the functionality of Kukini. This particular setup is intended for a records producer, that is, someone who is packaging and sending records to us. On the left-hand side, you see what we call the accession progress viewer, which gives you an at-a-glance indication of what the status of all your submissions to us are, all submissions of this particular user. On the top there, you see a bar indicating the progress of a submission that we sent ahead of time for example purposes. We'll talk more about this in a moment. On the right-hand side, you have a transfer panel. This is what you will actually use to select files and send them to us, and we'll now demonstrate how that works. At the very top, there's that drop-down menu in which you would select an RTP. Again, an RTP indicates, has information about what the contents of a record are, or should be. Below that is file selection. Click send file, it opens this dialog. You navigate to your files, and here you can see, files that, these particular files visible here are filtered according to the RTP you've selected. The RTP specifies specific file types that are expected by the archives. In this case, we're looking for, vital statistics, which is a record series that the archives is in the middle of digitizing. We're looking for PDF files, and we're looking for XML files. Of those two varieties, XML files are considered indices, that is, files with information about other files in the submission. So you can see the view has been limited to just PDF files and XML files, and the XML files, which are potential indices, are marked with a different icon, if you can see that. This is all intended to make composing records as simple as possible for the end user and to, as much as possible, reduce human errors before anything is actually sent to us. So you select those files, they appear in the file tree, and you click transfer. It uploads, verifies right. So once it's accepted by us, Kukini receives confirmation. You get this this dialog that says it's been accepted, and a status indicator will appear on the left-hand side. As you can see, in the case of these two submissions we've made, there are no problems with them. So they've pretty quickly gone to the end of the current pipeline, which is a phase we call records extraction, if you can see the label there. Now, let's try submitting a bad record, something with a virus in it. So here we have a test file that has virus signature in it. We transfer this, get a submission, there. You can see there another status indicator has popped up. This one has stopped at the phase called virus check, and the bar has turned red to indicate that there was a problem with this submission. Now, the process of the pipeline isn't completely finished yet, but the process of transforming submitted files into a format that is viable for long-term preservation can take several weeks, potentially more than a month. During that time, we want to give records producers as much visibility into the system as possible. And one of the ways we do this is through this status indicator, so that you can tell at a glance what the status of all your submissions to us are, so that you are not in the dark. If you click on one of these bars, it'll open up this secondary panel. This is not implemented yet, but what we want to put here is additional information about that particular session, the one you clicked on. Information such as the exact output of different phases of the pipeline, how long it took to complete them, when those phases were completed, etc. Another example of some of the information we hope to put there in the future, eventually. And that is Kukini in a nutshell. Now, once the record is submitted through Kukini and arrives at our side, we begin the actual process of preservation. Before that, we'd like to talk briefly about persistent IDs, because it's kind of an important concept in our system. A persistent ID, or PID, is just a unique identifier, and everything in our system is given a PID. Everything from the packages of records sent to us, to the individual files in that package, to events that occur during the course of processing. Those PIDs are generated by us, we keep track of them, and they are never reassigned. Those PIDs are given to entities in the system, and they are associated with those entities forever. If at any point in the future you ask us about a record or a file with a particular PID, we and the system will know exactly what you are referring to, and we'll be able to pull it up. Likewise, once we hope to get a web front end for you outsiders to look into the system to look up records eventually. They'll be able to look up records by the PID. And regardless of how long into the future how far into the future they do this, that PID should always pull up the same entity, the same record. This gives us a couple of advantages. First of all, it protects against naming collisions. As Adam mentioned, it's very likely we'll receive files that have the same name and extension, for example, annualreports.pdf. This prevents a number of possible errors that can occur as a result of that. And again, helps us to do lookups, gives us a static identifier for that particular entity. The archives is again committed to maintaining these PIDs and their association through all technological upgrades and format migrations till the end of time. Very important concept to understand here. Now, let's see. Right, so this again is our full processing pipeline. Once it's transferred to us, the first part of the pipeline is this portion on the left-hand side, which we call the transfer stage. This takes place in a secure area of the system. And during this time, what we try to do is verify that files sent to us are not corrupt and not malicious in any way before we begin before we do any further processing. The first step of this transfer phase is what we call SIP upload. SIP in this case stands for Submission Information Package, just a term we use internally for the records you send us, the package of records that you send us. Its primary purpose is to listen for submissions from Kukini, bring them into a system, and trigger the rest of the ingest pipeline. But it also checks for the presence of certain files that we expect to be there, certain files that we need to be there for archival purposes. First of those files is what we call bag info. On the right, now this contains information about the files that we add to the what is sent to us in addition to the files selected by the user. Accessions packages sent to us are stored in what is called the BAGIT format. That's a standard put forward by the Library of Congress. It's an archival format. It contains a bunch of files selected by the user and some additional metadata files, which again contain useful archival information. Now this file here is one of them. This is called baginfo again, and it contains a listing of all the files that again we add to the package. On the right-hand side there in blue, you can see the names of the files that we added to the bag, and on the left-hand side you can see the hash values of those files in green. Hash values are, as Adam mentioned, unique signatures for those files. You get them by taking the file, passing it through a mathematical formula. You get back a hash value. The useful thing about these hash values is that if the file changes, the hash value will also change, and this gives us an easy way to check whether or not a file changed in transit. The hash values you saw on that file were generated on the client side at the point of transfer. On our side, what we'll do is generate those hash values again from the files we've received and compare the hash values we've generated to the hash value generated by the user. If they don't match, we can assume the file has changed somehow, perhaps it's been corrupted in transit, and that would trigger an error. That's baginfo. Next file is the manifest. Very similar to baginfo, except that this contains information about files submitted by the user. So again, in blue you have the file name, and in green you have the hash value. In this case, you can see that the full path to the file as it existed on the original system is preserved along with the name of the file. This is very important from an archival perspective, because the location of the file on the system can contain important information about the relationships between files. For example, files in a directory may refer to one another. They don't make sense if taken out of that context, and so we need to know where they came from on the original system. The directory itself may also contain valuable information about the file. For example, if you have your, you may have your annual reports.pdf file in a directory named 2005. That is very useful to know from an archival standpoint, and so we preserve that information here. And finally, we have the provenance file. This is a file containing identifying information about the system and user who transferred this file to Kukini. In particular, we are looking for the when, the who, the how, and the where from this particular submission came. So at the top you can see there when you have the date of transfer, the time, who, you have the person logged into the system, their contact information, the department, division, how, Kukini, and from where, information about the system, the MAC address, operating system, IP address, domain name, the user logged into the system at the time. This is very important in helping the archives clearly establish the identity of the person who sent this, and thereby establishing the authenticity of the record. Again, it is as Adam mentioned, it's entirely possible to preserve the integrity of a forgery. So we want to, as much as possible, gather evidence about where this file came so that we can prove its authenticity. After SIP upload, after we've checked for those files, we move on to what we call bag check. This checks those files you've just looked at, looks at their hash values, and does that actual comparison to see if there is any sort of change in the files in transit. So we confirm that everything is there and that it is in the uncorrupted state. We are checking that the integrity has been preserved over that transfer. In the event that we find any kind of error here, the sender and the archivist are notified by email. And this is an example of what that email will look like. You can see there's an explanation of the error, a time and date on which you caught the error, what the results, what the module that outputted the result was, the module that outputted the result, and the result itself, and contact information telling you who you can get in touch with for questions or to try to rectify this problem. And again, this is something we'll do in conjunction with the accession status viewer in Kukini. We want to keep the records producers as informed as possible about the status of their submissions. Following bag check, we have virus scan, which does what you might imagine it might do. We scan all the files sent to us for viruses. We don't want anything malicious getting into the system. Now, all state computers have virus scanning software installed on them already, which is sufficient for the vast majority of cases. Because we're the archives, because we're dealing with a lot of sensitive files, because one malicious file could potentially compromise a great number of files in our system, we want to make extra special sure that everything that comes into our system is safe. So what we're doing is using a tool called Metascan. This lets us run multiple commercial virus scanning engines on everything that's submitted to us. At the current time, we're set up to run 8 separate engines on everything that passes through the system. In the event that a virus is found, we will attempt to clean it, remove that infection. And in the event that isn't possible, an error will be triggered. And in either case, an email will be sent to both the submitter, the archivist, and in the case of viruses, IT. And again, this is what the email looks like. You can see all the information, what stage failed, in this case the infected file, who to contact. And of course you'll notice that this email is different from the previous one. All the emails are, of course, tooled towards the specific error scenario that occurred. And once we finish the virus scan, we move on to receive SIP. It is at this point in the pipeline that we are confident the files that we received are all present, so we preserve the integrity, and that they are authentic, that they came from a reputable source that we can verify. And of course that they are safe, free of viruses. It's at this point that we move it out of the safe area into the main part of our processing pipeline, and the actual archival portion of our operations begins, which Donji will now go over.
Thank you, Micah. All right, so once we've verified that the transfer is complete and it's safe, it's virus-free, we move it from the transfer area into the processing area. And that's where we prepare the records for ingestion into our system and for preservation. In particular, this stage that I'll be talking about is called the pre-processing stage, and it comprises these 6 steps: disaster recovery, records extraction, format identification, validation, characterization, and finally quarantine. So disaster recovery. The first thing we do is disaster recovery, and it moves a copy of the transfer as it came to us by Kukini to a separate location within the digital archives. And this location is then backed up to tape nightly and sent off to a separate location. And this gives us 3 distinct advantages. The first one is that if the archives experiences a problem, maybe we discover a major bug somewhere, we have the original transfers, and we can go back, fix that bug, and then re-ingest the records that we got originally. The second one is that if there's a wide-scale disaster, in the archives gets totally wiped out, we have the original records in a safe location so that we can re-ingest them back into the system. And third, if the agency experiences any system failures, the digital archives can then retrieve those records for you so that you can re-import it into your new system. After disaster recovery, we move on to records extraction. And in this process, we take the accession and we break it up into its constituent records. This step is actually very system specific. So we base it off the RTP that we create at the beginning, and the parsers that we create will be tailored specifically to the output of the system that your systems create for us. For example, in one case, an accession could be broken up by stripping individual rows from a set of indices. Sometimes it's every file in the transfer is a separate record, and sometimes it's a combination of both. So we'll be working really closely with you to create these parsers. And the advantage of this is that if these parsers are created correctly, we'll be able to identify any errors that happen during the transfer and tell you, hey, there's a missing file here, things like that. And as an example of this, here is an example of vital stats record that Micah mentioned earlier. And originally, this came through the system as 2 files. It was extracted into 13 different records, and each record contains two files. Thank you. And in the event of an error during records extraction, a separate email, just like virus scan and backcheck, will be sent to the transfer telling you what exactly went wrong. And in this particular case, we couldn't extract any records at all.
Technical difficulties, please stand by.
All right, so once we've extracted the records from the accession, we go on to format identification. And in this process, we go through each file in each record and identify the specific file format of that record. And this process is independent of any file extensions that the file might have. This is for 2 reasons. One, the file might come to us without any file extension at all. That's a possibility. And 2, the file extension itself is not enough information for our purposes. So for this particular step, we use a tool called Droid, or Digital Record Object Identification, which was developed by the National Archives of the UK. And so just to give you an example, PDF has been around since 1993, but since then there have been 7 major revisions, including one called PDFA, and not each file format supports the same set of features. And so this format information will be very helpful to our archivists in doing preservation planning. You might preserve one version of PDF differently from another version, for example. And so here's an example where we do format identification. And you can see that this specific format was identified as a format 101, if you can read that at the top there. Format 101 is Droid speak for XML file. So once we've identified the format of the files, we go on to validate these files against their own format specifications. And this is a very important step for the archives because this ensures that the files are readable and will continue to be readable into the future. And to support this step, we're actually using many third-party tools that are available, and we're doing constant testing with these tools to make sure that we find the best ones for each file format. And while we're not going to be able to support every file format available out there, there's just too many, we are definitely going to support the most common ones, PDFs, TIFFs, Office documents, things like that. And so we are constantly testing for the best ones. We're constantly looking for the best tools, and we're testing them against data samples that our partners have generously provided to us. And our system is designed in such a way that it's very easy for us to switch these tools in and out. And so here's an example of what we do, what it looks like during format validation. And you can see this is a format 20 file, that's a PDF, and we validated it as a valid PDF. That means all the stuff that's supposed to be in there is in there. And if there's anything wrong with the process, again, we'll send an error notification out to the Kukini user so that they can have a chance to fix it. After we perform validation, we go on to metadata extraction, or what we call characterization. In this step, we extract all the technical metadata possible from each file. And again, just like validation, we're using different tools for different formats, and we're always looking for the best ones. And this step is very helpful for 3 reasons. First, it enables advanced searching capabilities for the researchers. Second, it aids the archivist in preservation planning. And third, it helps document the authenticity of the record. And here's an example of things that we can extract from files. And so this was a PDF. You can see it's a 1.6, and this is a whole bunch of technical stuff that we can take out, and this is going to be very helpful for us. And the final step is quarantine. So the quarantine phase starts the countdown clock for the records to stay in a holding area, and this allows the virus scanners to catch up with their virus definitions. Maybe there was a virus that came out when the transfers were sent to us originally, and they haven't been caught yet by the virus scanner vendors. So this allows those definitions to catch up. So after the time expires, the records are moved out of the holding area back into the processing area, and they're rescanned with the updated virus scanners, and maybe we'll find any stragglers. And in addition, once the records have been inserted into the repository and into our database, we will continue to scan these files with our virus scanners as the definitions get updated. We'll also continue to rehash them to make sure that files haven't been corrupted while they've been sitting in our repository. Maybe the hard drives are failing, there's bit rot, things like that. And after quarantine, we move on with the rest of the pipeline, and now we're ready to perform our preservation steps, migrating files over and things like that. Thank you.
So what you're not seeing is a lot of the behind-the-scenes system integrity aspects that these guys spent a large amount of effort on, to the point, because quarantine in particular takes up a big chunk of time, we wanted to be able to protect against any system, any server failures. So behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of internal process and workflow checking so that if in the event that the server ever fails, we can go and unplug it, plug it back in, and we can still pick up and continue to process those records so that we don't lose what we have done, or more importantly, we don't have to go back to you and go, can you please retransfer those records to us? So that we can maintain the integrity within the system as it's being processed. So a huge part of the behind the scenes is really, really important, but really, really, really boring and hard to really explain to you unless we start pulling up the code, which we don't want to nerd out on you quite that much. So we've got a few more things that we want to do still in the whole pre-processing stage. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're not quite as polished yet as we want to be, but this is Electronic Records Day, so we needed to at least celebrate in some way. So in particular, we really want to start improving some of those visual interfaces, particularly Kukini and the emails, and be much more explicit in the detail notification of those emails. So if this is something that kind of interests you, we definitely would like your help. Because if this tool doesn't work for you, it does not work. So we want to make it capture the things that we need to do to establish the identity integrity, but we also want to make it as easy on you as possible. Because Kukini as a tool is really going to be the way that you interact with the archives. A lot of the digital archives functionality, the RTP construction, configuration, contacts, is all going to be occurring in the Kukini application that we created. So the more feedback you can give for us, the better off it's going to be. So as Donji mentioned, we're really, really searching high and low. We're talking to all of our archival friends in all the national archives and libraries that are really researching in this space as well, to make sure that we're using the very best tools we can and testing them here with our data samples in our environment. Because while it may work well for them, that doesn't necessarily mean it works well for us. And each format will be getting its own identification tool and its own validation tool and its own metadata extraction tool. So we've got a lot of testing we need to do. So we're always looking for more data samples if you want to help on that aspect as well. And we want to optimize the system. We want to throw so much stuff at this that you just would choke a horse, and make sure that the system can handle it and continue to run without skipping steps or introducing errors or failing. So we've still got a lot of work we need to do in order to get it to where we feel very happy and comfortable, and in particular, you feel very happy and comfortable. So when, again, we're talking about preservation, when we're talking about digital archives, we're talking about a lot more than just writing it off onto tape. When we say archiving, we mean protecting machine-readable records from loss, alteration, deterioration, and technological obsolescence in an environment independent from that which produced it in a demonstrably trustworthy way. It's a little bit more involved than writing it off onto tape. And each of these boxes is one of those steps that helps contribute to that. So we've discussed the first half of that pipeline, which is a lion's share of the work. The infrastructure's there. So again, the rate of progress is rapidly accelerating as we continue, but we still have some more to go. So there's still lots of opportunities for you to participate and to help out with this. And we're getting close to the end. You know, we still have to finish this preservation pipeline. We still have to make sure that as we commit to protecting these records, that we're doing it according to the best in archival theory, that we're following ISO standards, and that we're doing it in a way that we feel reasonably confident, because we can never be 100% sure, but we can get darn close, that we'll be able to migrate these files forward. Because again, the only constant is change. We've got to stay on top of this, because if we wait too long, we're going to have problems. All those WordStar files, we're not sure we can do anything with them, and we are definitely sure we're going to have problems documenting some of that authenticity and integrity aspects that we would have been able to do if we got it in early. So play early, play often, and help us, because we've got a lot of search interfacing to do. We're just taking these records in right now. The whole public aspect, how do you actually get them out again, is going to be a really, really fun exercise. Because again, we want to tailor these searches to the records and to the needs of the designated communities, so that different groups of people looking for different types of records will all have search interfaces that are geared more towards their way of wanting to consume that information. So lots and lots of testing still to do. We need more data samples. We would love to have more partners come in and really start soliciting feedback from those of you, even if you don't have data samples or don't want to do that, but at least are interested in helping with the whole user interface, the visual aspect. We could definitely use your help. We'd love to have that. So given our current rate of processing and the help of our interns, we fully anticipate having the digital archives public interface functional and available to the public by this time next year. We've got a lot to do, and we're not going to release it until we are absolutely confident we've done everything we can to protect and secure those records. That is first and foremost in our mind. We are archivists. That's what we love. So we've got some more work to do, but it has been a really fun process. And so one thing to keep in mind is that digital preservation necessitates migration. It's not something we can just sit on those files and say, yep, we've protected them, we've got them off site, we've taken their hash values, we're good to go. Because again, WordStar. Now even Microsoft Word, the DOC files, are now becoming obsolete because of the migration to the DOCX files. So we want to make sure we stay on top of that technology curve. Being behind makes things much more difficult and really makes our job much more complex in establishing that identity and integrity, that authenticity, so that we can guarantee that the record is what it purports to be. So from our perspective, our jobs have changed. Paper you could sit on for 100 years and it's not really going to go anywhere. Digital records, 10 years, you're in trouble. So we now are in this continual process of research, testing, rolling out, verifying, and starting over again. So that we are expecting every 4 to 6 years to have to redo everything that we have done before. Complete infrastructure replacement, software upgrades, tools, from this point forward. It's a lot of work, but the benefits are amazing. We'll be able to store hundreds of millions of records and provide sub-second access 24/7, 365 to these records, and be able to say they are preserved, that we will commit to making them accessible 50, 100, 200 years into the future. So we need your help. We hope you enjoyed this and have a little bit better understanding of what it is that we're doing and the tasks that we have before us. So are there any questions? Oh, sorry. One more. There we are. See, the people that printed out the things ahead of time had a slight advantage.
Yeah, so I really like all the work that's been doing. You guys deserve great kudos. One thing that I would imagine that probably 4 or 5 departments provide 90% of all the documents that are coming into the archives. And in a lot of those cases, we're talking about thousands of documents that are going to be coming at one time. And so I think a user interface is going to be very useful for some users, but the big ones where you're going to get the bulk of your documents are going to be something that's server to server. You can use something like certificates or something. And I wonder if you've addressed that at all, and if you've maybe considered leveraging Tumbleweed that they have, that all the departments use for transferring information, or some other sort of open transfer mechanism that provides authenticity and all the other things.
So as far as the transfer goes, we are really trying to use the Kukini interface to the extent possible. Because in a transfer to transfer, yes, we know that they got there, but it doesn't necessarily capture some of that from who, from where information that we consider to be very, very important moving forward. Now, for those that can provide us an automated extract, for instance, a nightly database export, we will definitely work with them to try and automate the Kukini aspects, the things that we are capturing behind the scenes, into that process so that we can automate it to the extent that's practicable. So we've got it set up now that, in my experience in Washington State where we did this, very, very few systems were able to do this in an automated process, completely end to end. So it typically required somebody at the agency or somebody at the archives with appropriate access to once a week or once a month run the appropriate reports to extract the data and then get it uploaded. So one of the things to note is Kukini as a tool is meant to be used over HTTPS, so secure web browsing capabilities. But for larger data samples, we intend to provide functionality where you can also do it offline. So that we'll write directly to an encrypted hard drive that we provide. So that, again, we secure that, but also account for very large amounts of data. Because if you're sending us gigs and gigs or terabyte of information, you probably don't want to send it over the web. And when I say web, I mean exclusively internal state networks. It's not like it goes out to Google and back, but internally. And in particular, we are very interested in working with HIC because on automation to the extent possible. Because we know you guys deal with a lot of that stuff. And so absolutely, the more eyeballs off, the more automated we can make it, absolutely better for everybody involved. And again, we've got a couple things behind the scenes that produce that when, from who, how, and from where that we can help integrate into some of those processes.
Mine is really a question more for Susan. The archives, you're responsible for the historical archives where you have very important documents that researchers use a lot, and people doing genealogy. So I saw the marriage records up. Those we want to keep forever, correct? But then we also have the other function of archives, which is keep other state records that have, according to the schedule, you got to keep it for 7 years, you got to keep them this year. Is this project only dealing with the historical part?
Permanent records.
Okay.
I had a question about the vital stats records, especially birth certificates. What is the process for people with public access requesting a record that's confidential, or maybe where something has to be redacted? How does that tie in?
And I'm going to start repeating this because we are recording this. So the question had to do specifically with those records that we bring in that have elements that are exempt from public disclosure. What is that process going to be? So that's part of why the records transmittal plan is so important. Because as an archives, we don't know your records like you do. So one of the things that we ask for is we need you to tell us, does this record potentially contain elements that are exempt from public disclosure? If the answer is yes, we mark those files. We ask you, are there fields that we can disclose safely so that we can at least let people know we do have this birth record, for instance, but it's potentially exempt from public disclosure. So we may be able to give them name. We have a birth record for this person, but we can't tell you anything else. The intent is to have a little button down there and a little citation block that says, to receive a copy or request review, please contact. So that on a one-by-one basis, as needed, we can have review done for those records. Because we cannot do an eyeballs on based on the hundreds of thousands of records we're going to get. So if there's a reasonable chance that it is exempt, we will mark it as such and deal with as needed basis for review, working with the agency to determine who's most appropriate to make that review. Because again, you know your records better than we ever will. So that's why it's very important that we have this tight relationship and ask these questions ahead of time. Anybody?
When you open up to the public, you also open it up to the other applications that may have access as well too?
So when we open it up to the public, are we opening it up to other applications? Are you talking more in a...
Another private entity says, I want access it via the web. And instead of using your web app, they use their own web app to interface like a Linux system.
So the answer is, are we going to allow third parties to access our data directly rather than going through our interface? And the answer to that is definitively not if we can help it, simply because of the security protocols involved in there. We want to make sure that we can respect those things, and if it really becomes an issue, we can discuss that at a future date, but currently the plan is secure records will not be accessible over the public interface. You will only be able to access those through Kukini, and that those publicly disclosable records will be accessible through a web interface. What about state within state? The intent right now, based on partner feedback, stakeholder feedback early on, you will have access only to your records. So you will not be able to see the secure, confidential, restricted records from other agencies. Questions?
Aside from the file format which like PDF, HTML, what are the other file format system?
We will, so the question is beyond the real common TIFF, PDF, HTML, what file formats can we take? The short answer is whatever you produce. Because we are not going to dictate you are going to produce records only in these formats, because those are the easiest for us. So for a vast majority of the files, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been enough movement in the digital preservation field that we have viewers for almost everything, including GIS, which is one of the most perplexing issues in the archival space right now. Some of those are going to be more preservation ready than others. We will always maintain the native file as you send it to us. Even if it's the most proprietary, there are 3 copies of software in the world that can read it, we will still preserve it. Whether we can provide access into the future, that's part of the preservation planning aspect of the research we're doing now. So we at least are committed to keeping the bits alive so that you can always use them again into the future. And we're going to do everything we can to find viewers to make that accessible to the public, to validate and make sure that that record conforms to its file type, and to extract as much metadata out of it as we can. We think we can get there with almost everything. but I'm sure somebody out there is going to surprise us. Anybody else? Oh, we love this stuff.
So are the budget delays behind you then?
So are the budget delays behind us? The answer, thankfully, is, Susan, you want to address this? You know the process better.
Well, hey, we never know what's going to happen with the budget, but we do have the digital archives supported by a special fund. And this is the first year that we actually are using special fund money for it. So hopefully, unless the village raids all the special funds, we'll be all right. We can't do that.
Last call. One digital archivist and 2 Uber nerds, no waiting. So in that case, I first off want to thank Donji and Micah very much. This is their first time ever doing this. And they have worked very, very hard over the last year. Micah actually started out as one of our interns. And then when we had a position come open, he'd done such a great job. He applied and was very, very qualified for it. So we're very, very fortunate that he was able to do that. And then I want to thank all of you for coming and for caring. Because without you, we cannot preserve those records. And a lot of you, I've seen the same faces. You've been here from the start, and we cannot thank you enough for that. So again, thank you so much for coming. We'll be here. If you have any other questions that you think of, please come and ask. So thank you very much.